반갑습니다. 제가 영어를 사용하는가 한국어를 사용하는가 하는 것은 이제 오디언스의 그 성격을 보고 결정하는데 지금 보니까 한국 분들이 그렇게 많은 것 같지가 않아요. 그래서 제가 영어로 진행하도록 하겠습니다. And it is great pleasure for me to serve as a moderator of this session. And I think that our session is really featuring the best people we can get. Okay. And let me introduce our panelists, each of them. And my immediate left is Professor, Honorable Professor Gareth Evans. He was a former Foreign Minister of Australia for 8 years, and he was also founder, convener, and the chair of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Disarmament. And also you all know that he was responsible for the R2P right to protection. And also he is the winner of this year's Jeju April 3rd Peace Prize. Let us give a big applause to Gareth Evans. And next is Minister Sung-hwan Kim. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade during the Lee Myung-bak government, and also he was our ambassador to Austria, and he is currently chairman of East Asia Foundation, as well as president of Jeju Academy. Let us welcome him. Next to is also Ambassador Liu Jianmin. You attended here before, right? No?
No.
Yeah.
First time.
Oh, the first time. I confused with another Undersecretary of Foreign. I'm very sorry for that one. And, Ambassador Liu is a very, very renowned foreign service officer, renowned foreign service officer of Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs. He served as the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also he was an Undersecretary General for Social and Economic Affairs in the Council of United Nations. And it is a great honor for us to have Ambassador Liu here. And also we have another very distinguished guest from India, Ambassador Sujita Mehta. Okay. Ambassador Sujita was ambassador to Spain, and also she was an Indian representative of United Nations Disarmament. And at the same time, he was a Vice Foreign Minister, what in India called the Secretary West, as well as he was a Joint Secretary in the Office of Prime Minister. It is a great honor for us to have Ambassador Sujita. Let us welcome her. And these four ladies and gentlemen will be presenters, okay? And they will be giving 5 to 7 minute basic position remarks. And that will be followed by comments by Professor Won-hyuk Lim. Won-hyuk Lim is a professor of KDI School for International Public Policy at the Korea Development Institute. And Won-hyuk Lim, he's an economist by training, but he is a very well respected commentator in international affairs. We invited him to serve as a commentator because he's recently doing a government project on Indo-Pacific strategy. Therefore, he should give us a very educated comments on your remarks. Okay. I organized this session, and the age of transformation, Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. I'm trained political scientist. I still remember reading Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution in late 1970s. And according to Thomas Kuhn, when there is a change of theory or paradigm, okay, there is always crisis of existing paradigm or so-called normal science. And that crisis of existing paradigm triggers immense intellectual debates. And then contending theories and new paradigm emerges. But what is strange about this Indo-Pacific paradigm? There was no such a debate. One day, Asia-Pacific began to disappear, and all of a sudden, Indo-Pacific began to dominate our field. Nowadays, very few people talk about Asia-Pacific, but we still have APEC. We still have, okay, all kinds of Indo-Pacific dialogue and discussions and etc. Okay, CPTPP, the RCEP, or East Asia Summit, they are all extension of open regionalism in Asia-Pacific. And during the days of Asia-Pacific, we talked about multilateral security cooperation regime. CSCAP was created within that context. And China, Russia, North Korea were welcome to join APEC. There was no crash of civilization. Therefore, it is a very beautiful paradigm. However, all of a sudden, we have an Indo-Pacific paradigm, which emphasizes alliance, collective defense. It emphasizes decoupling, okay? And concerns of supply network by one side. And at the same time, we are talking about collision of democracy, crash of civilizations again. Therefore, as a political scientist, I was so much puzzled by this development. Why there is an immediate transition to Indo-Pacific without having intellectual debate? Okay. Therefore, with this background, this intellectual background, we organize this session. Therefore, I hope that you can give, I gave a set of questions to you, all of you, and also you prepared written remarks. But I hope you can, address these issues to the audience. Let us start with Garrett Evans.
Well, thanks, Chung-In. I was involved from the outset as Australia's foreign minister in the late 1980s and most of the 1990s in the creation of all the early regional economic and security dialogue architecture, including APEC and the ASEAN Regional Forum, that we still think of as being at the heart of the concept of the Asia-Pacific, as Chung-In has just said. And I've certainly always been pretty comfortable with that terminology or that paradigm. It did, at least for a very long time, capture both the increasing integration economically and the like-mindedness politically of most of Pacific-facing Asia, both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, along with Australia and New Zealand, both of us with strongly European histories, but recognising that our future lay much more with our Eastern geography than that Western history. And it reflected, that terminology, the desire of all of us in East Asia and Oceania to maintain and to increase the engagement of the mighty United States economic engine in our region. It also reflected the desire of most, if not all of us, to maintain the military commitment of the United States as well as a perceived stabilising force. So Asia-Pacific language certainly, I think, captured the mood of the time. The idea, however, of conceptualising the geopolitical essence of our region as the Indo-Pacific has been gradually gaining traction since the early 2000s, partly as a result of the growing visibility of India as both an economic and a political player, partly in greater recognition of the really critical importance of open Indian Ocean sea lanes, especially from the Gulf, to the economic health of East Asia, and of course partly as a result of China's increasingly visible and increasingly assertive willingness to expand its own influence westward. The concept of the Indo-Pacific really took off after 2016, when Japanese Prime Minister Abe made a speech referring to a free and open Indo-Pacific as being a core national strategy. Terminology which was then enthusiastically embraced by the Trump administration in the United States a year later. And then with Indian Prime Minister Modi in 2018 for the first time clearly articulating an Indian vision of the Indo-Pacific region, and Australia around the same time, and particularly in a foreign policy white paper of 2017, identifying, quote, a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific as being our country's most important national interest. Since ASEAN in 2019 then decided that it needed to be part of the action to accommodate itself to the concept and to protect its long-asserted centrality in regional affairs by developing its own ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, AOIP. Since then, there's been, basically, as Chung-In just said, no looking back. The reality is that the new language seems here to stay and is more and more supplanting rather than just living alongside the older concept of the Asia-Pacific. There are two basic ways of looking at this development: to be relaxed about it or to be concerned. I've tended, like most of my fellow Australians on both sides of our own political divide, to be in the first camp, to be relaxed. Why? Because if one takes it, the concept, as simply recognising the reality that India, which largely excluded itself from engagement with the building of the Asia-Pacific institutions, as we now know them, is now really a major player, actually and potentially, both in security and economic terms, in this whole space. And given that, it's hard to argue with conceptualising the region more broadly. Again, similarly, if one accepts, as I've always been inclined to, that Indo-Pacific is not just a maritime, but a land-based construct, in exactly the same way that NATO is not about the body of water in the North Atlantic, but about the continents either side of it. If one accepts that it's a land-based construct and not just a maritime one, embracing the whole of continental Asia, and very much including the Korean Peninsula as part of that, I think there is little reason for the region's land-focused powers to be agitated about the concept. And again, from an Australian perspective, explaining why I've always been comfortable about it, and from Indonesia's perspective too, straddling both oceans as we both do, there's also, I have to say, the attraction of being geographically at the fulcrum of the region as defined, rather than being essentially at its margin, and without that taking any skin off anyone else's nose. But there is another way of looking at the issue, which I can well understand gives more ground for concern. That articulated, among others, by our chairman, Chung In-moon, and by the present opposition in South Korea, and also by a number of respected thinkers in Australia and elsewhere. What's the basis of that concern? Well, I think this, that it's overwhelmingly, the concept is overwhelmingly maritime focused and indifferent to the reality of continental Asia and the issues which preoccupy its land-focused member states. There's a concern that the Japan-inspired and initiated terminology of a free and open Indo-Pacific, with its implied enthusiasm for electoral democracy and unrestricted markets, is designed to isolate rather than to include China. There's the concern that for the United States, the Indo-Pacific is all about security. It's all about military power. It's all about similarly containing China and retaining primacy, and that the concept plays explicitly to its advantage as still the world's most dominant maritime power. And finally, I think on the concern side of the equation, there is the concern that the military arrangements that have been so enthusiastically supported by the United States and focused inherently rather more on confrontation than finding avenues for cooperation, and above all here I'm talking about the Quad, and I guess AUKUS as well, the Australia-UK-US agreement. The argument is that these matters of concern to many other countries are institutionally synonymous with the concept of the Indo-Pacific. My bottom line, I guess, is this. The Indo-Pacific is not as inherently problematic a concept as some people claim, and I think it can still be thought of simply as a rational, conceptual accommodation to new economic and diplomatic realities, above all the emergence of India as a major player. But I think we can and should accommodate ourselves to this linguistic shift, this paradigm shift, if and only if, and these are three big qualifications, that acceptance does not carry with it, one, an obsessive preoccupation with maritime security at the expense of everything else, two, if it does not carry with it inherent antagonism to China and an unwillingness to defuse tensions and search for common ground where that's possible, and if it does not involve inherently an embrace of American primacy in perpetuity, an unsustainable aspiration and one destined to end in tears, not only for, I think, the United States, but our region and the wider world. If we are all able to think of the concept, the paradigm of the Indo-Pacific in those terms, subject to those conditions, then I think it's a concept not only in practice here to stay, but it's a concept which deserves to stay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Minister Kim?
Thank you, Professor Moon. And I'm very pleased to participate in this debate of interesting topics. When Professor Moon wrote an article, why it happened in Korean newspaper, usually I argue with him in our office because I meet with him very often, but this time I didn't have any time to argue with him. But as he mentioned, even for me, Indo-Pacific is not that familiar because when I was active diplomat, when I was Director General for North American Affairs of our Foreign Ministry, my counterpart was Assistant Secretary for Asia and Pacific. So frankly, for me, Asia and Pacific is much, much familiar because this concept has been made only in 2016, officialized. So when this term in the Pacific was first appeared, I was wondering why Prime Minister Abe made that concept. So I think this in the Pacific is a joint product of Prime Minister Abe and President Trump. So I had my personal question, why Japan raised this issue? Sometimes Japanese government today made a very good terminology like human security. Now human security is everywhere now. Even I was at the CES this year. The main theme of CES at the Las Vegas was human security for all. So in that point, that human security has a success. And this time again, I thought, why Japan did? So I did make my own research, why, the background or rationale of Japanese doing that. And I found that the same situation in Korea as well. In 2016 US presidential election, Trump made an unexpected victory over Hillary Clinton. I personally supported Hillary Clinton because she was my counterpart. And Japan also supported, maybe they don't have any right to vote, so I mean, inside their mind, they supported Clinton. But when President Trump was elected, Prime Minister Abe, he thought he didn't know well, and he was very worried about what President Trump said during his presidential campaign. Because always, I think you remember that President Trump said, Korea and Japan, they are doing kind of free ride for their security. They're taking advantage of US. They should pay more for US military stationing in both Korea and Japan. So that's why Prime Minister, he need kind of new approach to the president-elect whom he doesn't know well. I think that's why he moved very quickly. And I remember that he was the first foreign leader who met with then President-elect Trump. And he used this free and open Indo-Pacific. He succeeded in making very personal, good relationship with President Trump. So when you say Indo-Pacific, we can simply think it reflects the growing importance of India, or security and economic issues in the Indian Ocean are interconnected with those of Pacific. So we can simply think that, but if we think this is the joint product of Prime Minister Abe and President Trump, then we cannot deny that at that time their concern was rise of China. So I said basically they shared this concern about Chinese, increase in the influence all over the world. So, as Gareth mentioned, Prime Minister Abe, I think he studied this concept of Indo-Pacific for a long time. So when he proposed the phrase Indo-Pacific, he knew that the power of this terminology in shaping policy and the people's thinking. And I think he thought the phrase Asia Pacific, it conjures the geography of East Asia with China at the center. That's why he wanted to escape or avoid this kind of situation. During my research, I found a very interesting article by Mr. Suneo Watanabe, who is the senior fellow of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And he claimed that Prime Minister Abe's efforts to synchronize Japan's security stance with US policy were originated not in the optimism and trust in the US commitment, but in the pessimism and the fear that the US would become increasingly detached from the region. So what I want to tell, my point is that this Indo-Pacific is the outcome of the election of President Trump. So if, for the time being, regardless of presidential election outcome next year, this Indo-Pacific concept may continue. But when domestic political situation in the US changes, then always this terminology can be amended or changed as well. That is what I'm thinking. Let me just briefly talk about Korean perspective. Last December, Korean government declared that Korea is an Indo-Pacific nation, and it will increase engagement and cooperation with the Indo-Pacific to advance freedom, peace, and prosperity in the region. So it means Korean government accepted this Indo-Pacific concept. And also Korean government made it clear that it would neither target or exclude any specific nation, saying that it would implement its Indo-Pacific strategy based on 3 principles of cooperation: inclusiveness, trust, and reciprocity. Particularly, Korea recognized China as a key partner for achieving prosperity and peace in the Indo-Pacific region, with whom it would nurture a sounder and a more mature relationship based on mutual respect and reciprocity. So most scholars interpreted the Yoon government's declaration of Indo-Pacific strategy as shifting from the strategic ambiguity of the previous Moon Jae-in government to strategic clarity in the midst of intensifying US-China strategic competition. So I think Yoon government's Indo-Pacific strategy speaks its will to reach beyond Northeast Asia and to actively seek out agenda for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. Core lines of efforts to pursue Indo-Pacific strategy, Korean government stressed its will to contribute to the economic and the social development of the Indo-Pacific through, they used the term contributive diplomacy commensurate with economic stature of Korea. So my recommendation to this point is that Korean government should make real contribution to the Indo-Pacific region, and Korea should find the need of the countries in the region and expand mutually beneficial projects by preparing detailed implementation plan together with countries in the region. Before I conclude my remarks, I just want to briefly talk about whether these 2 competing visions, I don't like the term competing visions, but anyhow, in the Pacific and Asia Pacific can be compatible. I think so, because the exempling one of the most prime example of Asia Pacific is APEC. But still, India didn't join the APEC, and the US is doing chair country of APEC. And this time, just 1 or 2 weeks ago, in the margins of this APEC meeting, China and the US met. So still in the Pacific, Asia Pacific concept is still going on there. But in the Pacific is a kind of political consequences of US election, and they have a very unpredictable President Trump. And that's why Japan created this kind of concept. So I think this geopolitical concept can be evolved and can be changed. Yeah, that's what.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ambassador Liu, it's your turn. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Moon, for inviting me to be in this panel. I'm honored to join this great panel. Dear colleagues, I think that because the topic for this panel is the age of transformation, whether it's Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. Before I make any comment, I think let me see if it was to be really, it's not the issue of Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. For this world, we're experiencing the most difficult days since the end of the Second World War, and even since the end of the Cold War, including the Ukrainian crisis continue going on. I think it'll be so. When we're talking about the Ukrainian crisis, they're affecting not only the Europeans, but also the world. But from Asian, I'm more about what we can do for Asia, what the future for Asia. I think that Asia has been a pace setter for global development and a promising land of cooperation since the end of the Cold War. So I think even we're still affected by the COVID and the slowdown of the global economy, but Asia continued to be seen by all the international organizations, IMF, World Bank, and the United Nations, to be a home for promise, for growth. So, however, Asia, it should be noted that Asia is a continent of great diversity. I think in that respect, it's more diversified than Europe. That's why we should have more worry for that. Countries in Asia differ in their history, culture, tradition, and social systems, with varied security interests and aspirations. Like in Northeast Asia, the shadow of Cold War still persists on the Korean Peninsula, and the regional security mechanism has yet to be established. In Southeast Asia, the internal problems of one country are complex and national reconciliation is yet to be achieved. In South Asia, in addition to the territorial disputes between some countries, the mutual trust among neighbors remains a problem. So what's worse for the entire Asia? The meddling of big powers from outside the region has added to the security risks facing Asia. So now if you talk about competition and confrontation, I think there are big powers not confronting not only in Europe, but in Asia. So I think, of course, President Xi put forward a global security initiative in 2022 after the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis. He calling on all countries to rise above series of geopolitical security and the zero-sum game. Instead, to embrace a vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. So we call on Asian countries to bear in mind special reality, to bear in mind the bitter lesson in our history. This is a very special lesson of Asia from Europe, when most of Asian countries were either fully or partially colonized by Western powers for more than a century, and when most of Asian countries were invaded, occupied by the military power, by the militarist power, until the end of the Second World War. I think for most of our Asian countries have that memory. So, colleagues, I think when the G7 met in Japan, in Yokohama, what Chinese people are thinking? The G7, I think they are all part of the Allied forces who invaded China 120 years ago. So we, the Asian countries, should cherish the peaceful and stable development we have enjoyed since the end of the Cold War, though the shadow of the Cold War still lingers on the Korean Peninsula. And we, the Asian countries, should place an Asian security path featuring extensive consultation, joint contribution, shared benefits, and win-win results. I agree with both Minister Evans and Minister King that we actually, for Asia Pacific, I think for the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, Asia Pacific cooperation has emerged and developing not very well, but still works. 30 years ago, President Clinton hosted the first APEC summit in Seattle. This year, U.S. is going to host its next APEC summit. I don't know, one of the coastal cities of the Pacific in California. So Asia-Pacific still works. Because we also noticed that in recent years, the concept of Indo-Pacific region, which is different from the Asia-Pacific region, has been initiated, and the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy has been formulated and promoted. In my opinion, whether it's Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, to judge whether a strategy is good or not, one only has to see if this strategy can unite the countries in the region together, or whether it can contribute to regional and global peace and development. Unfortunately, these certain countries interested in this concept have been drawing lines by ideology, by using the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, attempting to build exclusive cooperation mechanisms, such as Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Chip 4 Alliance, Mineral Security Partnership, and other value-based cooperation mechanisms, deliberately creating tensions and decoupling. In essence, this strategy is a zero-sum game driven by self-interest and the maintenance of its own hegemony at the expense of other countries' interests. They are doing this, which is obviously not in line with the common interests of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And it's difficult to get universal support of the international cooperation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think to achieve the real and lasting peace, development, and prosperity in Asia, in my humble view, following three things need to be achieved. First, to carry forward the Bandung spirit. The Bandung spirit and the 10 principles advocated by the Asia-Pacific Conference in 1955 embody the wisdom of Asian African countries and peoples, have become the basic norms of international relations universally observed by all countries. I don't remember Korea, Republic of Korea or North Korea were part of it. I don't remember. But China, India, Japan is part of that Bandung Conference. Asian countries should follow the spirit of Bandung in dealing with each other. In other words, respect the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries, recognize equality of countries regardless of their size, commit to non-interference in each other's internal affairs, and settle disputes peacefully, and refuse to serve the special interests of major powers or through collective defense arrangements. Second, to uphold the concept of common security for Asia. We need to combine national security with the common security of all Asian countries. That's why I raised this issue. I think I'm worried. Each of the Asian countries are talking about their own security. But how about regional security? Security for all. all Asian countries, we should respect each other's core interests and the major concerns instead of building one's own security at the expense of the others. All countries, regardless of size, strength, or wealth, have the right to participate equally in regional security affairs and likewise have a responsibility to uphold regional security. Third, we need to continue to promote regional cooperation within existing structures until we find a common place. Last year, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the RCEP, entered into force. Unfortunately, Ambassador Sajaka, India found, I think, at the last moment, withdraw from the ratification. Hold its ratification for the RCEP in view of the internal domestic process. But until into first RCEP, marking the official launch of the world's largest and most promising free trade area. So RCEP, with developing countries as the mainstay, prioritizes common development and adhere to the goal of high-level openness, which will promote the further release of regional economic growth effects and contribute positively to the promotion of global governance changes. IMF forecasts that the net GDP growth in the RCEP region will reach 13.3 trillion in 2022 to 2028. This would be 17% higher than the combined net GDP growth of the US and the EU. Therefore, all parties should continue to make good use of this partnership, fully understand the importance of RCEP with a global perspective, promote a high-level opening process of RCEP based on regional development needs, and promote the docking and integration of RCEP and CPTPP in due course, so as to lay solid foundation for realizing the common expectation of all parties on the establishment of the Asia-Pacific FTA. Actually, Chinese government already announced that they are preparing to join this CPTPP. Meanwhile, the ASEAN-centered regional cooperation mechanism is becoming more and more mature. So countries should continue to strengthen cooperation within the framework of 10+1, ASEAN plus another country, plus Korea, plus Japan, plus China, and ASEAN plus 3, and China, Japan, ROK cooperation, etc., to promote building a new pattern of high quality and inclusive regional economic integration. So dear colleagues, I think now it's really the Asia security is at the forefront for us to think of. So together jointly with the Asia Economic Cooperation. I think I'd like to be through this Jeju Forum and other regional forums, we can really find a common ground for all these issues, in addition to the issue of concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. By the way, our president in 1955, President Lee Sung-man didn't attend the Bandung Conference, but Kim Il-sung of North Korea attended Bandung Conference. And also,
It's an inclusive, very inclusive conference.
yeah, Bandung Conference is the beginning of so-called AA bloc, Asian African bloc, okay, and that was led by Prime Minister Nehru, President Sukarno, Tito, and Nassel, and likewise. But apparently, we belong to the American alliance system. Therefore, our government didn't join the Bandung Conference. I'm just clarifying you. Now, Ambassador Sujita, now your turn. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Professor.
You can use it, just, yeah.
I'm very grateful to be here at the Jeju Forum for the first time, and particularly privileged to be here as part of such an important...
Closer to your mouth.
Do I need to? Yes, better. Well, this is
Cannot hear you.
no.
임 교수 거 줘보지. 아니 그 터치하지 않은 게 좋아. Everything is set.
Yeah.
Now work.
Okay. Let me restart. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here and particularly to be part of such an important and distinguished panel. The good part about a dialogue of this kind is that it allows each one of us to unpack the topic in a particular way and to read into it and to bring out perspectives which are of salience. Now, I would like to look at it as a concept in terms of determining, is there really a shift when we look at the terms Asia-Pacific versus or vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific? Has it really made a huge difference to what we see? And Minister Evans has brought out the manner in which the term evolved over time. Minister Kim has talked of how the Asia-Pacific notion arose, and you made reference to the fact that India is not actually a part of APEC. To my understanding, India has been wanting to be a part of APEC, but the factual position that we've been told is that there is no agreement on enlargement, and as such, we'll have to wait. I would like to look at this topic in terms of assessing regional cooperation. Our analysis of regional cooperation processes, by and large, is based on, I think, the cooperation processes that arose in Europe after the Second World War and arose from the tensions of the Cold War. The European approach was to develop a multiplicity of many layered institutions which could act as a venue for cooperation, for contention, for non-controversial cooperation, for all kinds of things. And in a sense, I think what happened in Asia was not dissimilar. What happened in Asia, I think we were trying to get past the legacy of the Second World War, the impact of decolonization, of conflicts in Indochina, on the Korean Peninsula, and the impact of a belief in the domino theory. So there were several tendencies which were at play in our continent. And the notion of the Asia-Pacific, in a sense, enabled us all to get past those. With the Asia-Pacific, with ASEAN at the center, seemed like a quiet sanctuary, which gave all concerned a sort of space in which everyone could get on with the urgent business of economic development and the acquisition of economic strength. And I think that was something which all the countries in Asia, members of the Asia-Pacific community, could subscribe to. Now, the post-Cold War period actually saw phenomenal economic strength amassed by countries in Asia, and Asia's growing visibility and weight in world affairs became a familiar trope. And underlying the set of questions that lay out the parameters of this present discussion suggests an unease that the moment for Asia and ASEAN's centrality may have passed, notwithstanding the larger and newer envelope of the Indo-Pacific. Now, I have one concern about the use of the term Indo-Pacific if we are to limit it to a combat command only. Because I think that misses certain very important elements, and I am going to come back to this in a moment. Because for us, there are two aspects, for us in India, I think there are two aspects which are important. One is that we must not focus on a purely military understanding of the Indo-Pacific. I think that is something which is very, very important. The present conjuncture is one when beyond Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, European security arrangements are under almost existential pressure. And I think that is something which we all have to be aware of. Brexit, the several waves of Eurozone stresses, disagreements within Europe on social policies, and now Ukraine, crises seem to be becoming almost endemic in Europe. And the US pivot to Asia has now been superseded by a focus on salvaging Europe in the near to medium term. And I think it's important for us not to allow a sort of crisis mentality to build in Asia, because that will be hugely negative. We're in an age of multipolarity, and the generally current idea that we see is that groupings and formats of convenience are developed depending on the subject, and that actually gives us all a certain degree of flexibility. And multipolarity should, by definition, to my mind, be flexible and inclusive. I think those are attributes which are important to retain. And flowing from that, multiple actors in Asia need to focus on developing and renewing habits and structures of cooperation to ensure that no crisis is precipitated. And we should not be waiting for one to get the US to refocus on Asia or indeed the Indo-Pacific. I think we have to look out for Asia and to recreate or develop cooperation with Asia, within the Asia-Pacific region, within the Indo-Pacific region, to be open to multiple groupings, to be open to multiple formats and poles, and I use that word advisedly, and to avoid the rigidity of binary choices. I think binary choices will harm us and hurt us all. At this point, I also want to mention that the responsibility of a hugely significant and powerful actor in our region, such as China is, to seek open-minded cooperation with and display understanding of others' concerns in the region would contribute substantially to a constructive environment. This should also help avoid the dangers and risks of over-militarization of the Indo-Pacific. This last is a troubling possibility when we assess the potential and looming dangers of a crisis that no one wants, including the possible actions of DPRK and the tendency to seek the spotlight through dangerous moves. I think that is something that we all need to be aware of. Now, having said all this, while the strategic contestation in Asia has increased, and that increase may unfortunately continue in the short term, I think it is important to be aware that the aggregate economic weight of countries in Asia is unlikely to diminish, in fact, will almost certainly grow. And regional efforts to avoid serious disequilibrium that could come in the way of beneficial economic activity will and must continue. It would be useful to promote avenues of dialogue, building on Asian strengths, building on ASEAN approaches to avoid the risk of over-militarization in the Indo-Pacific region. It is true that international relations are not static and do develop simultaneously at several levels. All of us are aware of the need to respond to immediate and proximate challenges, even while we look at the longer term. Now, we have seen a very expansive definition of the Indo-Pacific, But I think we also need to bring in, and I'm glad that that has already been referred to, the continental dimension to go beyond a purely maritime understanding of the Indo-Pacific. But we also need to look at the region beyond, i.e., we need to look at the western part of the Indian Ocean. We must not stop at the borders of the Indo-Pacific Command and not look at it as purely the division being between the Indo-Pacific Command and the CENTCOM, but I think we need to be aware of the western part of the Indian Ocean and of the continental dimensions of the areas washed by both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Professor Imonyuk. Okay. You have a maximum 5 minutes, okay? You're a commentator. Not
Okay. Let me briefly talk about the transition from the Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and then talk about the key features of Indo-Pacific strategy, and then conclude with what is to be done. Well, I disagree with Professor Moon. I don't think there's a ready acceptance of the switch from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. In fact, when I talk with my colleagues and people in Korea, there's actually a sense of unease and dismay about the transition, and especially among colleagues who devoted their professional careers to Asia-Pacific and APEC, there's a sense of anger and cynicism. And in fact, I don't think it's only the Koreans. Even in the United States, people like Bob Zelig probably feels the same way about life's work being ripped to shreds. The kind of sentiment that George Kennan expressed in his New York Times interview regarding NATO expansion at the end of the 1990s. So why is Korea so concerned? Well, if in the Pacific region includes both maritime and continental Asia, then you don't really have to switch from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. In fact, if you look at the origins of Indo-Pacific, going back to Prime Minister Abe's speech about the confluence of two seas in 2007, it is maritime focused, and it is anti-China. So in fact, if you look at Indo-Pacific strategy, what stands out is three, in my view: anti-China, exclusive grouping, security-focused, and finally, what's interesting is that the United States tries to do this on the cheap, without devoting resources, really. There's a big contrast with what the United States did in Europe after World War II. There was the Marshall Plan, which was equivalent to about 1% of Western Europe's GDP at the time. But there's no equivalent to Marshall Plan today. I mean, I would think if the United States is serious about countering China's expansion, it would try to facilitate energy transition and climate change response in the Asia-Pacific region by devoting some resources on this front. But in the IPEF, or Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the only thing that has been put forward is what is called the Upskilling Initiative, which tries to address digital skills among women. I mean, let's be serious, okay? So what's really driving this Indo-Pacific strategy is United States wish to maintain supremacy, okay, almost in a nostalgic way, without devoting real resources to try and counter China's expansion. What is to be done then? I think, as a number of speakers mentioned, I think it's important to insist on inclusivity and common comprehensive security. I think it's naive to address the security dilemma by increasing military preparedness unilaterally. I mean, the whole history of Europe shows what happens if you follow that approach. World War I, World War II, As Vice Minister Mehta mentioned, Europe was able to get out of that predicament by adopting the Helsinki process and switching to common and comprehensive security, even though it's backsliding now. The second thing I'll emphasize is manage risks and don't go for decoupling or de-risking. I think there's a big difference in that, yes, we can face risks, but instead of trying to separate completely or adopt an expansive concept of risk elimination, I think it's important to focus instead on small yard, high fence, dual-use technologies, where all sovereign states will try to safeguard related technologies, personnel, and equipment, and also reduce vulnerability to economic shocks by having strategic reserves, having some balance between domestic production base and international trade, and capping import share from a single country. We have an interesting precedent in International Energy Agency, IEA, in response to the 1973 oil shock. If you think about it, IEA members decided to adopt the principle of maintaining 90 days of strategic reserves. At the same time, it didn't have much success with joint release of these reserves. And what's interesting is that IEA vote shares, proportional vote shares, are based on 1973 oil consumption. So, over the course of 50 years, the world has changed, and I think it's very outdated to just insist on IEA approach. And I think it has important lessons for what is likely to be an important challenge for not only IPEF participating countries, but also China and countries outside in terms of critical technologies and minerals and materials. And finally, the last thing I'd like to emphasize is to have some humility and have a sense of history. Back in 1972, when Park Chung-hee adopted Yushin Constitution, Korea's political, the outside Freedom House assessment of Korea's political freedom was at a very low level. I mean, Korea was not a democracy all the time, right? And even today, when you talk about democracy versus autocracy, I kind of wonder how our Vietnamese colleagues feel about that, right? And there's a process through which countries, develop their economies and their politics, and I think we have to be, we have to have some humility before naming and shaming other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a really wonderful session. I have never seen such a articulate and eloquent speakers. But before I open the discussion to the floor, I will do some of a 10-minute interrogation of our panelists here, and then I will open to the floor. Please contact moderator so that you can get a microphone, okay, when you want to raise your questions. But I have one question to Ambassador Liu. Minister Evans said that I'm relaxed about Indo-Pacific strategy, provided that the United States can satisfy 3 no's. First, no, okay, maritime focus. No antagonism against China. No American primacy. Do you think the U.S. will accept those 3 no's by Garrett Evans?
I hope if
Please use the microphone. It is now recording.
Thank you. I think I hope that Minister Evans could persuade President Biden to accept that, his proposal, the 3 ideas, that'd be fine.
China will welcome the idea. No problem with Indo-Pacific strategy.
I think it'd be, for Asian countries, not the issue that we're juggling from one concept to the other. It's an issue to be what kind of regional mechanism we really need to have a more inclusive, more open, more cooperative, more effective regional mechanism.
But here, and let me ask a question to Minister Kim, and I will get to you. Philip is talking about President Yoon Suk-yeol's Indo-Pacific strategy is based on the inclusive. Even you mentioned too, inclusive, mutual trust, mutual respect, and etc. But I don't see inclusiveness because China is excluded, Russia is excluded, North Korea is excluded. But Minister Kim, how do you explain that one?
Well, as Mr. Liu said, China already applied CTPPT. So maybe someday they can apply for IPF as well.
Sure, is China going to apply for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework?
Not now, but
No, I think until now, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure where this Indo-Pacific strategy can go. But until now, it's a politically motivated anti-China strategy.
Okay, now Garrett, now your turn.
Well, I think you're all getting a bit overexcited about the terminology here. I mean, Indo-Pacific's essentially a fairly neutral concept into which you can pack anything you like. And if you want to pack into it antagonism to China, and if you want to pack into it irreversible commitment to American primacy, and if you want to pack into it irreversible conceptual focus on maritime issues rather than anything land-based, then there is something inherently problematic about it. But the truth of the matter is, even if Asia-Pacific was still the dominant paradigm language around the place, we'd still have a problem with American instinct for primacy, American antagonism, and others' antagonism to anything China wants to do, and a willingness to, build a lot more focus into maritime security issues. So, I mean, language only takes us so far, and I think, Professor Lee and a couple of others, yourself included, Chung-Yin, are getting a bit overexcited in terms of the inherent problem, neuralgia, that's problematic character that's associated with the language. I think we need to work hard to address those problematic issues and to get a common security focus, get the cooperative focus through all the other mechanisms that are available and not get too hysterical. Just one other quick comment on Kim Sung-won's historical explanation of how it all began. I'm sure he's absolutely right when he says that Prime Minister Abe in Japan invented or popularized or gave new momentum to the concept of Indo-Pacific because of his preoccupation with trying to exclude China from the centrality of the focus and to play a different conceptual game. But I have to say the notion of him thinking that he could win the heart of President Trump with a new conceptual approach strikes me as a bit implausible. I mean, President Trump is not known for having any intellectual preoccupations whatsoever or any interest in conceptual concepts for their own sake. And the notion that you could win his heart and his permanent alliance commitment by simply a linguistic exercise, I think is carrying it a little bit too far.
After they made joint statement in Japan, U.S. changed the name of command from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific Command. So, no, don't underestimate his
Assistant Secretary for Indo-Pacific, and then Congress changed it. Now, Asian Indo-Pacific Subcommittee on Asia-Pacific, now it's a Subcommittee on Indo-Pacific. Now, United States, American government is going through the name-changing business. By the way, I think Ambassador Liu raised a very, very important issue. He raised 3 things. Let us go back to speak the Bandung Conference, okay? Common security and regional cooperation. Now, hold this idea of a Bandung spirit is a Zhou Enlai, Prime Minister Nehru, President Sukarno, okay? Not so. They really formulated it. What is the Indian stance on that one? Do you still honor? I understand that your foreign ministry has been keeping to the idea of neutrality and inclusiveness. Can you comment on it? And also, let me add one more one. We are all confused about Indian identity. India now is part of Indo-Pacific. India part of BRICS. India part of whole this Bandung conference. Can you tell us about the Indian identity?
Thank you, Professor. Certainly. I think it's important to recognize that we all inhabit a multiplicity of identities. I don't think there is a single identity that, in fact, that was one of the points I made, that I don't think we should look at this or these terms in terms of a binary choice. I think we have no option, particularly at a time of multipolarity, that we all have to engage with multiple groupings for different objectives and different goals. So I really don't see an intrinsic contradiction between being a part of several apparently exclusive bodies or organizations or groupings. I think we should be able to deal with all. And the point that I was trying to make by citing the European experience was to say that just as we are able to engage with multiple actors in the ASEAN Regional Forum, in the ADMM, you spoke of the regional body, I don't think that those necessarily have lost their vitality or their need. I think they continue to have space, and I think we all need to continue to engage equally.
Okay. Can I just add one more point I meant to add before, and it follows on from that. If anyone thinks there's something inherently problematic about the Indo-Pacific, have a look at the ASEAN. There's no ASEAN member of this panel, but have a look at the ASEAN approach to the Indo-Pacific. The ASEAN Outlook, AOIP as such, has not got a skerrick of a militarization commitment running through it, hasn't got a skerrick of inherent antagonism to China running through it, hasn't got a skerrick of visible affection for irreversible US primacy running through it. You can approach the concept of Indo-Pacific in a way that is consistent with the commitment to common security and consultation and dialogue that all of us on this platform are obviously passionately committed to. So again, don't get hung up on the terminology. Just work on defusing the terminology of some of its more problematic, neuralgic and ugly characteristics.
No, Gerard, I do not agree with you. Form determines substance. Language determines reality.
Only if you buy into it, Chung In, by writing the sort of articles that you've been writing and Professor Lee's been writing. Write some different articles.
Anyhow, now, Minister Kim Sung-hwan argued that there got to be harmonization of Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. Minister Kim is very well known as a kind of balancer, moderator, harmonizer. Can you elaborate on that point? How can you, because if you listen to Ambassador Liu's remarks, obviously Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific is contradictory, conflictual. But you're saying that we need to harmonize. How can you harmonize it?
You see, I think the key is whether there is a dialogue between US and China. So as, Minister Mehta, as she suggested, we should develop habit of cooperation rather than habit of confrontation.
We used to have a habit of cooperation.
I think one of the ways is to use, I'm always suggesting EAS. So East Asia Summit, there are all ASEAN countries, even Russia, China, US, Japan, all big countries are participating there. It's a summit level. So if we use EAS, we can harmonize both in the Pacific and Asia Pacific.
Then as Secretary of the Ambassador Sujita pointed out, if there is ASEAN centrality, maybe then we can harmonize it. But do you think that we can have an Asian Minister Kasit? Can you make a comment? Can ASEAN sustain its centrality in Indo-Pacific strategy? Well, we have a former foreign minister of Thailand there.
If I be
become the Prime Minister of Thailand, definitely. with Gareth Evans as my chief advisor. I think the point is that, as I mentioned in the previous session, the ASEAN leaders of the 10 must renew their working relationship of the past elders, in the sense that try to meet as many times as possible, do a lot of shuffle diplomacy, and among the 10 foreign ministers, there is a need for one foreign minister to take the leadership of most of the world in moving around the capitals and try to control the others to come along. That has been a missing element for the past 10 years. That has to be renewed. And hopefully, either Indonesia as the biggest member or Singapore as the most intellectually, what you call NPT, should take that type of leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, Professor Lim, you said that Asia Pacific is not dead, okay? But I don't see any research money going to the study of Asia Pacific. In the US, in South Korea, in Japan, all the research money go to study of Indo-Pacific. Even this Jeju Forum, now we have almost 12 panels on Indo-Pacific, okay? That is a good sign.
But
Yes, Ambassador Liu, and then,
unfortunately, the concept of Indo-Pacific popular only in 3 countries: U.S., Japan, Republic of Korea.
No, not like that. Seven ASEAN countries joined IPEF. You know that.
Right, I know.
Yeah,
we
yeah,
understand why.
yeah.
We understand why.
okay, Ambassador Liu, please explain why.
I don't know why. Because I think because nobody knows what is meant by Indo-Pacific strategy. It's a military alliance. It's an economic cooperation. It's a maritime cooperation, a continental cooperation. Nobody knows. On that point, I agree with Mr. Evans. I think this is, this origin of the concept is not clear. For what purpose?
Okay, Won Hyuk. Okay, now your turn.
Can you?
And also, those who want to raise a question or comments, please raise a hand. Okay, Spencer Kim, and then, okay, we have one from India, one from Vietnam, okay? And who else? We have 3 of them, but I will give you later. Okay, let Won Hyuk respond first.
Well, there's a fad to just focus on Indo-Pacific as opposed to the Asia-Pacific. But with the United States hosting the ASEAN summit this year, actually even the United States is interested in the Asia-Pacific to the extent that you can use the convening power of APEC to bring the countries together. And another thing I'll add is that with respect to India, if the rise of India was the central challenge, then APEC could have easily included India back in, say, 2011 when the United States hosted another ASEAN summit. My understanding was that some in the Obama administration were in favor of that, but others wanted to demand some trade concessions from India as a precondition for joining the APEC. So.
No, 6 minutes left. Therefore, make your comment or question very short. Spencer Kim, the founder of the Pacific Century Institute in Los Angeles. No, it's not working, yeah.
I have 2 comments. One comment is when you constituted this forum, this particular path, you failed to include an American input because you have included China, or participation from China, but you did not include American input. And I looked around here in the audience, there are only 2 Americans sitting here. So I think that's something that you as the convener should make some adjustment. 2, I was appointed to Asia Pacific, APEC member by President Bush for 3 years. So I was part of that Asia Pacific, and it was an economic cooperation, the effort to rebuild or add to the world post Cold War. 1988, 1990 is when the Cold War ended. This was a very similar, in my own concept, post Second World War rebuilding of the new order. But instead of America putting out their own cash, they decided to bring in alliance of this. And anything that we agreed in APEC was not binded. They are all voluntary actions. Now, let's think where we are. Indo-Pacific is just like in NATO. In 1990, they start to expand. That's the post-Cold War. So we now are getting into the second Cold War. And you said the age of transformation, it is Asia-Pacific economic cooperation to Indo-Pacific military alliance.
Okay.
So that is the difference I think we have to recognize.
That's a very good point. Okay. Next. Would you identify yourself? I forgot your name, sir.
My name is John. I teach at Mahatma Gandhi University in India. Well, about the history of Indo-Pacific concept. Perhaps there is something that the Korean can also claim a bit of history to it, because in 1996, during President Kim Yong-sam's visit to India, he actually referred a connectivity corridor between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So there is a reference to that, and there's a vision out there. So that it's actually 10 years before Shinzo Abe's the speech in the Indian Parliament. Well, I mean,
would you make it shorter?
Sure.
We have
my question is to Ambassador Zemin. You've been talking about the Asia for Asians, but could you elaborate, when you talk about Asia, what actually mean by it? I mean, do you have a geographical imagination
thank
in your
you.
mind?
Okay, Ambassador Lee, would you respond to that one? What do you mean by Asian?
I think in the UN terms, Asian is a very inclusive concept, including Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, and now I think they also include the Pacific Island countries. So it's a very inclusive, broad. But of course, for the current regional mechanism, it's not that so inclusive. But fortunately, current regional mechanisms, they have been more amicable because they are more focusing on economic and social cooperation. But I think that's why I think there's a difference. Why a difference on Indo-Pacific strategy? Because its origin closely linked to military alliance. That's a problem.
Okay, now, colleague from Vietnam, would you make a quick comment?
Thank you, distinguished panelists, for your enlightening presentations. My question goes to Ambassador Liu Chunmin from China. Do you think that, I think first of all, terminology and concept carries political and security connotations. So do you think China's GDI, GSI, GCI set of initiatives would be a viable alternative to the current Indo-Pacific strategies?
Okay, Ambassador Liu.
No, I think China does not intend to replace any mechanism. These are just development initiative, security initiative, and civilization initiative. These are just ideas, concepts. I think this is just for promotion. We need to share some of the concepts. So like the idea for common security for Asia, I proposed at this forum panel that we need to discuss what kind of common security we could have from concept to mechanism, to arrangements. I think Ambassador Mehta mentioned Europeans, due to the lessons learned from the Ukrainian crisis, they haven't had any very effective continental European security arrangement. That's why they have a confrontation with Russia since even within the Cold War, during the Cold War, and even after the Cold War. That's why for Asia, we need to seriously sitting down and to see how we are going to have an economic arrangement, cooperation mechanism, how we are going to have a security mechanism to ensure that all of us will feel safe and secure. Thank you.
Thank you. I should conclude this session. It is really illuminating. It was an illuminating session. But as Minister Kim Sung-hwan pointed out, we might have to find some ways to harmonize Indo-Pacific versus Asia-Pacific, because we have a lot of good institutions under the Asia-Pacific initiative, starting with APEC and all other kinds of cooperation for development and etc. Therefore, it is very important for us to find ways to, cooperation. And also another one is, all the panelists emphasized the importance of a habit of cooperation. Particularly, Ambassador Sujita Mehta argued that we got to really cultivate, cooperation of habit. That is the real way to leading to common development, common security, even common civilizational coexistence too. But let me elaborate one important point. Intellectual origin of these Indo-Pacific strategies goes back to a book called Geopolitics of Pacific, written by Karl Haushofer, who really coined the term Lebensraum for Hitler. Okay. In that book, he argued that, look, who are colonizing all the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean? Great Britain, France, Great Britain for India, France for Indochina, Netherlands, Indonesia, United States, the Philippines. And he argued that Japan should take the lead to liberate those regions from colonial powers. And then Germany and Japan cooperate together. And in fact, the whole this idea of the greater greater East Asian co-prosperity, 대동아 공영권 idea, was greatly influenced by this Karl Haushofer. And I'm now tracing what was Abe Shinzo's intellectual origin of a meeting of two oceans. And I have a hunch it's Karl Haushofer, because Prime Minister Abe has great interest in geopolitics of 1930s and 40s. Okay? But I was shocked that very few pay attention to this issue. There was one PhD candidate at Harvard University. He wrote, his last name is Han. I don't know whether he's Chinese or Korean, either one of them. He wrote a very interesting article about intellectual origin of Indo-Pacific. And he argues, he read Germans. He cited from the, Karl Haushofer's Geopolitics of the Pacific, and said that its intellectual origin is from Karl Haushofer, okay, and trying to see that Germany and Japan working together to oust Americans and British and French from the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. That was the origin of Indo-Pacific strategy. Therefore, we got to really think about it, okay? Why you are smiling? But anyhow, it may be it could be a passing anecdote, but that, we got to really pay attention to intellectual origin of these ideas and have a fierce and intense debate so that we can make a more meaningful transition to one paradigm to other paradigm. If there is no such intellectual debate, then it is better for us to stay with existing paradigm of Asia Pacific. I will conclude it. Let us give big applause to the panelists here.